It's that time again. It's time for Work Watch. Well, when demands are made for an MP to lose the whip, in other words, to forfeit their formal links with the party, it often means serious allegations. It happened to Jeremy Corbyn over his response to a report about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and to Tory backbenchers over Brexit. It means they keep their seat but must sit as independents. So it's a pretty existential threat to a political career. For the first time, there's a serious attempt to have the whip removed from a Labour MP accused of transphobia by members of her own party. Well, Andrew Doyle, host of Free Speech Nation, is here to pick our way through this one. Who's the MP?
This is Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP, who, if you might recall, got into trouble a bit last year when she said that only women have cervixes. And this was interpreted as being a transphobic comment. And so this is, since then, I think a lot of activists, particularly this group, LGBT plus Labour, have had her in their
These are Labour members, a caucus within the Labour Party.
Yeah, I mean, they've got support from Peter Mandelson, Andrew Adonis. There are 19 sitting MPs who are patrons of this group. So it's quite substantial. This isn't just a group of Twitter activists who call themselves Labour. They are LGBT plus Labour. And they've now said they want the whip removed. They've really gone for her. And, of course, this has created a big stir, because what she's actually done this time is simply liked a tweet. This is a feature on Twitter, for those of you not on Twitter. It's a feature where you approve of a tweet by pressing like. And this was an American musician called Curtis Tripp, who had made up quite a provocatively phrased statement about how he didn't like the way that heterosexuals are often reclaiming the word queer, when, of course, the word queer used to be a slur that was used to attack gay people. So gay people of a certain age remember when it was used as an insult by people who were attacking us. And he's saying that he doesn't like it's become just a kind of way to get an edgy identity. You know, I mean, to give an example, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, his daughter recently came out as queer, and she said that what she meant by that was that she was demisexual, which means that she can only have a sexual relationship with someone she is emotionally attracted to or attached to. So in other words, for her, queer is old-fashioned heterosexual.
Wow.
That's all it is. So in other words, if old-fashioned heterosexuals can now call themselves queer, then it's meaningless. And that's what this guy was saying. He was phrasing it in a Twitter way, which means it's not particularly...
But just to be clear, I mean, in terms of the modus operandi, I mean, if somebody likes a tweet and that tweet is really, really objectionable, I mean, that could be a really unpleasant anti-Semitic tweet or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's, the actual action itself is sufficient if the content's dreadful enough.
Is it? Because you can like by accident on Twitter. If people are familiar with Twitter, I mean, let's not forget the whole thing about J.K. Rowling, the whole controversy there happened because she liked a tweet. And she had to say that she was looking at the tweet and she did it by accident, which is probably true. Now, I don't think we should be using this guilt by association method to attack people, The tweet in of itself, if they had a problem with the content of the tweet, they should have spoken to the person who wrote the tweet, not the person who liked the tweet.
I'll go with you this far. I mean, there's certainly a complete absence of process. If you're about to end somebody's career, be that in politics or business or wherever it is, you need to have a fairly watertight, robust process that can weigh the evidence proportionately and do all the stuff that our justice system does. And establish maybe whether, you can take into account mitigating factors like had a drink, maybe, or thumb slipped, or,
all sorts of things, yeah. But even with a tweet that someone writes and they phrase it poorly or it's a bit misjudged, I'm very wary about this idea that we use that then as a means to completely eradicate someone's career and reputation. This is at the heart of what we call cancel culture. And I think it's something that particularly politicians need to push back against. And I think Labour should be pushing back against this group, LGBT plus Labour, because they are participating in this kind of witch hunt mentality, which doesn't help anyone. If they've got a problem, they need to speak to Rosie Duffield and clarify firstly, how did she interpret that tweet? Because it's not clear from reading it. It's not sufficient, certainly not. It's a dangerous precedent to set, let's put it that way, if you start saying that liking tweets is sufficient to be punished.
Yeah. But we're seeing this, I mean, you mentioned that this is particularly germane to politics. We've talked about this in the past 4 weeks in relation to John Cherry, the SNP MP who got into hot water. She was gender critical. The party seemed not to be. There was a Green activist, a Green Party quite high up in the Green Party.
Yeah, that's right. It was the former deputy leader, yeah.
And then we've seen people leave the leadership of the Green Party, seemingly all around this trans question. So it is actually it's long left the abstract ivory towers of academia, and it's certainly now active in parliamentary circles.
It has the capacity to tear parties apart. Like you say, we've seen it with the SNP, we've seen it with the Greens, and now we're seeing it with Labour. And of course, it's because we aren't having the conversation about what people's perspectives are. Right? So I don't even know what Rosie Duffield's views on these things are, because all I've got is the noise on Twitter about it. And what would be interesting is if politicians could have a discussion about those who support the idea of gender identity ideology and those that do not, because that is a legitimate debate to be had, but it is being reframed as though it's just people who are for trans rights versus people who are against trans rights. This is an incredibly reductive, simplistic and frankly false perception of what that debate really is about.
Some of these politicians are getting ahead of the law, aren't they? Because the law is kind of over here on trans rights. I think trans activists would probably call it quite transphobic where the law currently is. But that is where the law is, right?
Well, they would like to see gender self-identity to be protected within the Equalities Act, and it's not at present. Transgender reassignment is protected, but self-ID is not. And feminists and campaigners for women's-only spaces are concerned about safeguarding issues. That if anyone can state that they are a woman and then they are allowed into those spaces, they're not saying that trans people are abusive. What they're saying is that exploitative people can use that as a loophole to get away with what they want to get away with. So I think a discussion has to be had, and the behaviour surrounding Rosie Duffield and this knee-jerk reaction to have her cancelled is precisely the kind of thing that the adults in the room need to be saying enough, right? This shouldn't be happening.
Well, let's try and test how many adults, as we see them, are in the room. There's a poll that's been published, a sample of about 1,500 people.
Yeah.
And this is the question of whether you would be willing to see books censored by the government for breaching rules on sexism, racism, homophobia. And you would guess, I would have guessed if you'd asked me that question before, that the number of, as a percentage, the number who would say yes, censor, would be in the single figures.
Yes.
It's not, is it?
40%, yeah. And this is, I find this quite frightening. And in fact, when I tweeted out this poll the other day, a lot of people responded saying that can't be true. People are in disbelief about this. But it's a substantial number they surveyed, 1,500 people. If it is true that 40% of the country feel that it's right that the government should be able to censor books that are perceived to be racist, homophobic or sexist, there's all sorts of problems with that. For one thing, in a literary context, you might well, as an author, want to represent those things in terms of a character or a plot or something like that. It does not mean that it endorses the things that you represent. We've seen this with To Kill a Mockingbird, which is an explicitly anti-racist book, now being called a racist book. But more than that, do we really want to trust the government to make decisions about what books can and cannot be published? I mean, this goes right back to John Milton in the 1640s, who wrote Areopagitica, which was his treatise against the idea that the state should censor books. And one of the points he makes, he actually invokes the Spanish Inquisition and said that the Spanish Inquisition started out wanting to purge heresy, but then eventually they attacked any subject, as he says, that was not to their palate. In other words, once you grant the state the power to censor as they would like to, even if it's for things that we don't like, horrible racist, sexist, homophobic things, if you grant them that power, it will spread and it will give them the ability to censor whatever they please. And that's a very, very dangerous situation to be in.
How do you pronounce John Milton's book again?
Areopagitica.
It's fantastic. I've seen that written before. Never knew exactly how to pronounce it. You are so useful. There were people listening to this and remembering, perhaps, and recalling a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about a school in Dewsbury, an Islamic private school, which had an Ofsted visit. They'd gone along, and in the library was a book which was seized and contained homophobic content. Now, there's a book that the state was censoring. I think I can guess, and what I hope you're going to say is there's a big difference between playfully conjuring with certain themes and advocating the slaying of homosexuals.
Huge difference. I mean, that's what that book was doing. But more than that, and most crucially, it was in a school. You can't have a book in a school library that calls for the execution of a certain group of the population. I mean, that's obviously not the case. But we are dealing with books that are published for adults in the country. We don't want to. It's a completely different thing. And I think a lot of free speech skeptics will use examples like that as a kind of gotcha to sort of say, well, you don't really believe in free speech. No, I believe in socialisation of children effectively, which means don't expose them to books calling for the deaths of other people. But that is not the same as me endorsing the state stepping in and saying you cannot read this.
What?
Areopagitica.
You're very, very good. Andrew Doyle.